discuss later. So mainly the Bauhaus Manifesto is nothing but a 4-page book that he introduced when he started the school, and he wanted um, this certain movement to have a set of rules, and he pointed it out as something that unites all kinds of art. So he specified them as 3 different parts, that is architecture, design, and uh, craftsmanship, were the 3 things that he wanted to combine. And this is the pointer. Is my pointer visible? Yeah. So this is like one of the covers that the book had, and these are like 3 stars, which showcase the 3 different kinds of artwork that he thought was important. So the stars represent architecture, sculpture, and painting, and he felt these stars were combining to form a beautiful space, which is the cathedral. So he wanted art to be combined to form something beautiful. He didn't want it to be in isolation. Okay, so there are 4 key points that this book follows. I mean that the ideas that he put forward. One is the form follows function. So he thought he decided that the basic thing that one must have while designing a cathedral is bridge.
You might have to repeat yourself. We've lost your voice entirely, unless it's me
Okay.
who's not being able to hear you.
1 second. Yeah, is it visible now?
Yeah, it's visible. I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. Maybe
Okay.
my a fault on my side. It's
No, no.
fine.
No, it was the same for me also, I guess. So I think it just
Yeah,
happened that way.
yeah. Okay, so in what he did in this under form follows function is also that he tried to bridge the gap between people. Like during that time, mass production was a lot, and even though people might have taken it in the negative way, he used that in the positive side as people producing something new and different, and the factories being able to produce them in mass numbers, hence saving time and money. And the second point was space, material, and money. So what he focused on was controlled finance and smart use of materials. What he wanted was the whatever we design to have zero waste production, but it should also be such that whatever you make should the time required for that also should be feasible. So he wanted designs to be durable and economical. Yeah. Okay. So, and then the third point was he believed in everything being new. So he was open to new ideas, new techniques, and new kinds of art. So previously, all the posters that we see, they had a lot of typography and a lot of over decoration. And then he came, he introduced graphic design where he focused on using a lot of negative spaces. And the fourth point was simplicity, which he believed that you didn't need any additional ornamentation. Once the function is designed and the form uh, is made through that, then that is all that's required. Like you don't need too much of yeah, you don't need to add any additional beauty. Like the simple is good. So he believed in clean, pure forms which are functional, and everything else follows as is. Raj.
Yeah, next slide. Uh, so the Bauhaus started as a school in Weimar, but then in 1925 they had a lot of cut off of in the funding due to the political reasons. So they had to shut down their school in Weimar and had to shift in Dessau. So during the shift, Walter Gropius had a chance to build his own architecture, and hence he made this new building. So, taking the school as a hallmark for what he believed, so the school reflected all the points that the manifesto actually said. So it's a building that shows how form actually follows function. Each of the uh, each of the functions has been laid separately, and the form of each of this function is different from each other. Then there's a use of new materials such as concrete, steel, and glass. There's no ornamentation to improve its aesthetics, and each elements from windows to the furniture inside were designed separately. And the Walter Gropius believed in having an interrelation between the exterior and the interior. So he had kept so he had done this in many ways. Athira, next slide. Yeah. So when the building was actually shifting from from Weimar to Dessau, Gropius was given a land which was completely far away from the city fabric. So he did not have any restriction as to what is to be built according to the context. So he could have chosen any form. So the first three show different forms that he could have chosen, but then he opted for an interlocking system with linking different elements in a very asymmetrical form. So the plan actually shows it's a pinwheel type of plan, and there's no hierarchy between the functions. Also, he adopted different heights according to the function that were within, and there's no central view. The building from each view claims to be as the central view. Athena, next slide. Athira? Yeah. So the building basically has three इसके पीछे वाला आतिरा. आतिरा.
हाँ, I've put. I think it's loading. थोड़ा.
We can see a festive. हाँ. Full screen नहीं है. So the building basically has three main functional building, that is. Yeah, so the building has three main buildings. The first is the workshop block, and it has all the workshops from dyeing, sculpture, weaving to exhibition spaces. Then there's the dormitory building, that is the third one in the picture. Then that has the housing for the students, and as well as the gymnasium, kitchen, and all. Then there's a fifth one, the technical college. So it's basically the college come school for the people of the Dessau. And then joining these three spaces, one is the canteen and the auditorium, that is the second one, and it was also known as the festive area. And then there's a bridge, administrative bridge, which basically houses the administration offices. Athira, next. Yeah, so this is the plan. So this is the ground floor and the first floor plan. So the ground floor plan basically shows the the workshop areas on the right. Then opposite to that, there's the technical college which show, with the classes, and in the up direction there's the dormitory building and the canteen and the hall joining the dormitory building to the workshops. In the first floor plan, we see that there's again the three of them and the administrative bridge that joins the workshop area to the technical college. Athira, next. Yeah. So during the construction of the Bowers building, every facade was different according to the requirements of the activities that took place within. So the first one displays the workshop wing, wherein there was a whole glass curtain wall, which provided maximum sunlight within, so it illuminated the space. And also there was full transparency of the interior from exterior, so people while walking from outside could see what is going on inside the workshops. The second is the technical school wing, wherein horizontal windows were used. So there was this provided adequate sunlight inside, but also maintained some kind of privacy for the students sitting inside the classes. And the third is the apartment building which houses the dormitories. So that had individual windows according to the rooms, and had maximum privacy among the three. Next. Yeah, so this is the interiors of the workshop wing. So uh, every workshop had its individual studio kind of a place, and the workshop places kept changing according to the project they were working on. And basically you can see in one of the pictures that during summers it was there was so much of sunlight inside that after working for some days, the students inside just couldn't work in the heat. So soon there were opaque curtains that were installed all over the building. So the basic idea that Walter Gropius had of transparency was did not actually work. And then the last picture on the slide shows the weaving workshop. So the Bauhaus was one of the first institutions where women also started working fully. So this is one of the weaving workshops that was installed for women from the Dessau city. Athira, next. Yeah, so this is the festive area. Basically, the leaders or masters of the powers believe that while doing sculpture art and everything, theater also played a very important role. So then this was the area wherein weekly events were held. So there was a stage, that is the auditorium, and the dining hall, and both these spaces were separated just by three doors, and the whole long space was used for communication and as a gathering space every day. Athira, next. Yeah. So then this was these are some of the pictures from the dormitory wing. So each individual student was given a 20-meter square space with a bed, a cupboard, and a study table with a lamp. And this is one of the view from the and also each dormitory had a balcony like projection, so that so that the students could have a glance of the nature and the landscape that was outside. So the last one is the photo from that one of those balconies. Adhira, next. Yeah. So during the construction of the stairs, also the stairs were basically designed in three parts. The middle portion was the widest, and it was used for going up, and the other two side side stairs were narrow and were used for going down. Also, the the stairs the wall behind the stairs was a full glass wall, uh, giving a view of the outside of the building outside. Then the right one is the administrative bridge. So the bridge basically was a joining space between the two wings and had all the administrative offices on the right of it. uh, Athira, next. Yeah. So the Bauhaus building was one of the first modern construction during those times. So basically, Walter Gropius used a steel and concrete basic frame, and the whole complex is united with these two materials, and then used the glass for the facades. Also, while its construction, Gropius, rather than using the standard columns, he used a, a, a column which was a V-shaped cornice column, which was basically a column designed during the Cubist movements. Then the facade of the building has a curtain wall, which was a new feature during those times, and was completely separated from the core of the structure. Then you also had different features such as cantilever balconies, s- which um, which basically were because were basically because of the function, and not because of the aesthetics. Uh, Athira, next. Yeah. So it also promoted the ideas of its manifesto. So the one of those ideas was the use of new materials. So this Gropius wanted to use these new materials, but only if they suited and were practical in their way. So then, while building, he used three of these materials, basically concrete, steel, and panels. And there were other small elements such as the mechanically opened windows. Then there was magnesium floors that were used throughout the corridors and the stairs. And the building was not colored at all. It was just simple lime plaster with so so the whole building is basically stark white. Then there were linoleum flooring in various colors. So this the floorings and many of the Bauhaus, the lettering that is done, both of them are produced in the workshop of the Bauhaus itself. And then there was radiators installed all over the building for the winter season. So basically, in general, the Bauhaus building was a reflection of all the things that he had stated in the manifesto. So it was kind of an example of the ideas that he wanted to lay. Athena, next.
Yeah. The screen is visible, right? The Gropius
Yes.
house. Okay. So, yeah, so the Gropius house is a house that Walter Gropius designed for himself. After this, he built this school in Germany. So, he got the position to be a chairman in the Harvard University. So, that was his shift into America. And he kept searching like appropriate houses that, defined his style, but he couldn't find any. So what he did was he decided to build his own house, which reflected all his styles from the manifesto. And he wanted to make sure this house was something that even the students he was going to teach could understand and refer to. So often while in the process of construction, he invited the students also to see how each and everything was done. So the concept was mainly that every part of the house was planned for maximum efficiency and simplicity, and the site of the house was on top of a hill in New England, and it was built on a hill which was near to an apple orchard. Okay. So the construction is mainly like a wood frame construction. Construction. It's something which is traditional to New England, a post beam wood frame, and he integrated new features such as long windows in the first floor and glass blocks in the porch. And he wanted to use all the American mass produce items also. So he wanted to kind of combine the traditional New England stuff and also the mass produced items. So this is the so this diagram is like just the basic wooden frame that the building had, on which he cladded it with either it was wood panels which were put into the facade, or it was brick and then plastered. And so these were the separate materials used in different elements. Like he used materials like cork in the stairs as a cladding, and then he used for the staircase railing, he used polished chrome, and he used redwood cladding in the court area, which I'll show you the picture. And then in the outside portion, he used a material called veneer tile, and in the master bedroom, the flooring is with Caesar stone, and then he used ceramic tiles in the bathroom, and in the roof deck he used tar and gray gravel. Okay, so how did he come up with this form for the building? So he chose a simple rectangular form, and he wanted the entrance to have like something that pushes you inside. So this is the entrance, and this is the glass block screen that's in front, so that there's a little privacy. So he enters like this. So when one enters like this, you feel like you're getting pushed into the building. So that is the pushy feel that he wanted to create, that as if you're forced into the dining room, the living room, and the study, which was on the ground floor. And he created a grid, a normal grid, and then he changed certain angles of certain surfaces so that you don't feel that uniformity, like you have that asymmetric nature in the house also. And as you can see in this picture, the roof is flat. He made the roof flat because for easy drainage and services. Okay. So the organization is this. So this is the entrance that I was talking about. So this is the angular entrance canopy that leads into the house, and in the plans they refer to the ground floor as the first floor and the first floor as the second floor. This is because the foundation reaches up to the level of the ground floor, which is why I'll be referring to these floors as first floor and second floor. And in the first floor, you mainly have the living space, and then on this side you have the service, which is for the maid, like her room, and this is the service porch for her to do her stuff. And this is the roof deck, which is on top, and a screen porch, which is for when people come, and the top portion is private, which is for Walter Gropius, and there's a guest room and also his daughter's room on the top floor. Okay, so this is the plan. So this is the first floor. So this is how you enter. So this is the entrance, and then here you have the courtroom, which I told the red cladding in the courtroom, and then there's a door which leads to a washroom, and then this portion is the service area. This is where the maid lives, and um, this is which leads directly to the kitchen, so that these the people living in the house don't get disturbed. And he wanted to create a sense of fluidity in the house. So what he did was he combined the living room, which is this, and the dining, which is mainly separated only by a curtain. And this is his study, which he and his wife would use to work in. And so this is the second floor. The second floor consists of his bedroom, a guest room, and this is his daughter's room, which is also connected to a roof deck. And what his daughter had requested for a separate entrance to her bedroom, which is why he also added like an external staircase, which I'll show in the further pictures. So this is the external staircase that he added. Like this was so that she could have privacy when she invites her friends, and people don't have to come all the way inside the house and then uh, enter into a bedroom. So yeah, and the elevation also he had done very specifically. In the front elevation, he didn't want to attract a lot of attention. He wanted it to be enclosed and have a sense of privacy, which is why you can't see much except for a little bit of windows. But in the rear, there was also a view that they could see of the landscape behind, of meadows and stuff. So which is why there are like more exposed windows, and that is the it's on the rare end of the house that they spend more time looking at the view. And in his structure, he had done a mastery of light. So in the ribbon windows that he put in the house, he wanted to minimize the barrier between the indoor and the outdoor, and also it was like it led to passive solar gain. And also the Bryce Soleil, it had mainly the shading patterns brought a different type of light effect, and it also blocked solar radiation during summers when it was intensely hot. Now, yeah, so this was the stone foundation that I spoke about, which reaches to the ground level. And other certain features in the house are the brick chimney and the glass blocks. They mention the use of glass blocks a lot, which is also there in the interior. So this is how it looks like. And this was the handrail of the staircase inside, and the cladding on top of it, the cork cladding. And yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so
Are you done?
yeah,
Or is there more?
just one more slide. So these are just the pictures of the interior. So mainly, what as you can see from the exterior and the interior, the exterior is mainly like plain. I felt it was plain, but the interior has a lot of like subtle colors, but it looks very nice. And most of these objects are what were produced in the Bauhaus School workshop. So, and he tried to bring as many as stuff he could from Germany and tried to incorporate that inside his house, so that when anybody comes in, they feel that, he not only the planning of the house, but also the interior structure, interior design is related to Bauhaus. And the exterior. So this is the separate entrance to his daughter's uh, room. So there's like a roof deck in front, which he built specifically for her, and this leads to the deck, and then that leads inside to her room. And this is the apple orchard that was facing the house. Like it was all around the house, and this is the screen porch where people come visit. And as you can see in the house, there were these you can see these white trellises. So that was mainly you can't see it in most of the pictures because it's not grown yet. So he wanted to combine his house with the nature around, so which is why he grew vines and red pink roses, so that they would grow and create a sense of privacy. So once it's grown, this is how it looks, and that's so that it would create a sense of privacy. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. One of the things I would like to suggest is that when you are making a presentation about a building, to keep it as kind of crisp as possible, which means in a sense that maybe you need to kind of organize your material through a particular kind of system. I know you had a system here which said interior, exterior, you went through the plans, etc. But what happens is that we get the same space, like for example, that terrace that you were talking about that he made for his daughter. You spoke about it on 3 different slides. Nah? So it just may be useful to kind of organize it such that we are getting a sense of what the building is in a tighter way. It's only a suggestion, but otherwise I thought that the presentation was very comprehensive and extensive. What I'm going to do is really I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bauhaus and really try and kind of think about where and what its influences have been a little bit. Because I think it's been one of the most important uh, generators of what we call architecture today, or what we call good architecture today, and especially what we call architectural education in this country. Its influence has been extraordinary. So let's just kind of go back to the story that that Rajan Athira told us, which is that the Bauhaus was kind of a movement that was started in Germany between the 2 wars, which is 1914 and 1939 or whatever, right? It was at that time. And as a movement, it was obviously reacting to what was happening in post-war Germany at that particular time. And if you know something about what was happening in Germany at that time, you'll realize that there's a great deal of like kind of, there's a great deal of devastation. You've lost the war. Now, after you lose a war, you feel like, you have this opportunity to kind of reframe who you are. Like, abhi kuch naya karna padega na hame, kyunki we have lost the war, we have suffered great humiliation, but also we have the possibility of reconstructing something completely new because there's the ruin of war. And now abhi kuch naya karna padega. And what do you base this new idea on? Now, this is an important thing to think about. Last week we looked at, I think we saw Corbusier, right? And we saw a certain idea of freedom that he wanted to instill, or that he was like kind of working towards in his architecture. A freedom of the body in space, a freedom for like a man to kind of be free. That sort of kind of imagination in nature. But Bauhaus doesn't seem to necessarily come from that school of thought. And by the way, if you guys have any comments or questions, please keep typing them in the chat box, and we'll get back to them later. But right now, I just need to kind of cover a little bit of ground, and Shirish and Janela can join in whenever they feel like they need to kind of add something. So I'll just cover a lot of general landscape, and then we'll come back. So. And one of the things that happens is that because history has treated you so badly that you've lost the war, one thing you start thinking about is the idea of rationality, right? Rational thought. An old idea that comes from the Enlightenment that says that, okay, now God is no longer the center of our own kind of lives. And we need to find another basis upon which we can develop a moral and ethical worldview. And ये जो worldview है वो कहाँ से आएगा? So we have to then trust in our own kind of reasoning. We have to be able to reason logically. Logic होता है ना कि ये that there's logic and mathematics that are at our disposal, and logic and mathematics is a uniquely human thing. Human beings can make sense of things because they can think logically. So what they start doing is that, can we then find a solution to the future of who we are going to be, and what role architecture, design, art can play for this new human being who is rational. Right? We have a rational person who's now kind of the modern human being. And to deal with this rationality, and you know what rationality is now, a belief in science, a belief in what you see, a belief in the empirical, all of these things, a belief that things make sense, is what you can do is that you have the mathematical that can provide you with such a possibility. And what is mathematics? Okay. Mathematics is a strange thing because it has the presumption of being universal. कि 2 + 2 = 4 nowhere around the world, everywhere around the world, right? I mean, it's the same kind of rules that apply all along the world. So what happens here is that with rational thought, you seem to be arriving upon a solution that can in many ways address problems that are universal issues concerning and housing and technology and all of these, and even questions of beauty can be addressed through the idea of rational thought. So if Gropius and the Bauhaus is basing its kind of idea about what a future city or what the future of architecture is going to be, it seems as if it's basing it on the premise that rational thought can be the solution. So what does it do? If you look at a lot of the work of the Bauhaus, especially, is that it starts trying to find universal rules, generic rules, upon which it can then build a future. Okay. And there are two tendencies to this, is what I'm kind of feeling. Right? One, it looks around and says, "Yaar, kitna sara machines hai, kitne sare factories hai." Yes, some factories right now, they are not producing anything that can be used for mass consumption. It's all like all the design stuff that is coming out is crappy design stuff. Okay, it is not one that can cater to the working classes. It is too expensive. It is wasteful. It's all of that other stuff. So can we use machine production, okay, to create design for larger populations? This is one very simple thing. It's a simple rational thing to think about. Right? The other thing it says is that, yeah, but very often, in this machine production thing, the product that you get is very like mediocre, like ganda hota hai, like even cheap hota hai, So it's important for us to have good design that can be produced in mass production. Now, what is good design? This becomes the question. And it's an interesting thing what they do is they say that good design, is in some sense has a universal understructure. कि क्या है ना कि आर्ट होगा, आर्किटेक्चर होगा, डिजाइन होगा, म्यूजिक होगा, जो भी होगा, लेकिन उसके बेसिस पे ना कुछ एक एस्थेटिक प्रिंसिपल्स रहते हैं. ये एस्थेटिक प्रिंसिपल्स जो होते हैं ना, ये aesthetic principles in some sense are what can be called and what we very often learn as basic design, which is compositional ideas of rhythm, structure, whatever, all of those things. So if you look at some of the work of many of the artists who then were with the Bauhaus, I think I'll just share the screen. So hold on. Sorry. Right? Can you guys see the screen? Hello?
Not yet.
Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Like this is somebody like Paul Klee. Paul Klee, who was very much part of the Bauhaus, right? You look at the kinds of work that they are doing. They are explorations of the surface, they are explorations of form, they are explorations of the line. One of the famous kind of people is Paul Klee, and his work, if you see, has these ways in which he's looking at texture, color, paper. He's trying to, in some sense, work with universal principles of art and design. If you look at how the Bauhaus course was structured also, the Bauhaus course was structured such that the first years were common, in the sense that if you're doing textile or if you're doing architecture, if you're doing art, the first years was a common course, what can be called nowadays a foundation course, where you learn the basic principles of design. And then they come up with a course that is, and then later on you begin to specialize in your chosen fields. If you think about things like the what do you call that, the National Institute of Design, the NID course, you'll realize that principle of there being a universal sort of code for design and the aesthetic, and that then specializes. You can see that influence even in courses that are there today around the country. Right? It's interesting to think about how did we get influenced by the Bauhaus, and I think I will come to that maybe a little later. The other thing that you find very importantly within the Bauhaus, I think I'll just kind of come out and maybe I'll share again later. Can you guys see me? Okay.
Yes, yes.
The other thing that you find in the Bauhaus, so far we have, let's say, two main kinds of principles. One is that, the new human being is a rational human being. Rationality can be used to resolve the issues of our cities today and the world today. The second is that the machine is a great thing for that. So therefore mass production is important because it can reach the most number of people. Okay, and see that, but mass-produced things need to be designed well. Therefore, we need to kind of think about universal design principles that can make these all, efficient and beautiful at the same time. The third is to think about is kind of the idea of what is rationally important for a building. And what you arrive upon is for a building to be a good building, it has to be a healthy building. Okay. Which means it has to have enough light and ventilation, it has to have enough access, it has to have all of these different things. So what you find with the Bauhaus is that, I'll show you again more sort of images. Share screen, na? Hold. Okay, it's a little confusing, but I'm going to try this. Can you guys see the screen now? Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, I think it's taking some time.
Oh, okay.
Now it's come. It's come.
So if you see this, which is a idea of a design by a person called Ludwig Hilberseimer, who was kind of part of the Bauhaus, and this is 1927 for Berlin. And as you can see, it has an echo of that Le Corbusier's imagination for what should happen in Paris, which is erase the whole older city because it doesn't give you light and ventilation. And then you replace it with these, which are these bars that are all in one direction, all because they have to face the sunlight in some way. And what you realize is that you'll see these kinds of typologies in Bombay all the time. Now, this is the SRA or the Mhara kind of housing complex. Right? These are again drawings that were made for the same new city, where there's a rational separation of different modes of transportation. The below ground is the trains, on the surface are the cars, above that are the pedestrians, and on top of that are the housing blocks. Another image of the same presentation. Right? This is the plan of it. But this is an important diagram that has been extremely influential in the way that we have thought of designing good cities. This is a Bauhaus diagram that is a light and ventilation diagram, right, by Walter Gropius. So what does he do? He's just looking at the different heights of buildings and the distance from one another and the least amount of distance that you need to get enough light and ventilation within each of these blocks. And our own kind of DC regulations, the DCR, are greatly influenced by things like this, right? To create a universal set of guidelines such that every room within your buildings is able to access healthy light and healthy ventilation systems. So now I'm going to kind of tell you, so this is the other sort of principle that you'll find very much as part of the Bauhaus. Okay. What happens is that, so this is the way in which the Bauhaus is growing. You have many different sorts of people within the Bauhaus. It's a collective of different kinds of people. You have some of the most famous names in art, architecture, dance, music are all in some senses involved with the Bauhaus school. It's a vibrant space. It's also very radical and it challenges all these ideas of history. It actually challenges history in its entirety, saying that history has taught us to make kind of buildings that are unhealthy and not ventilated. What we need to do is is to design a new way of imagining that emerges from rational thought that has nothing to do with history. Okay? And it's through rational thought that we will be able to arrive upon these buildings. And if you look at the Bauhaus building that was shown to us today, you'll realize that the logic of that building is completely about itself. It is not necessarily really dealing with the context and things like that. Now, it is a freestanding building whose volumetric relationships, are purely based on internal programming relationships, okay, and in questions of access. So it's a self-involved sort of idea about how the building is going to be. So, I was very, when you're studying architecture and all, you tend to kind of have these opinions about buildings and about people without actually having gone there. So earlier, especially because of the way that the Bauhaus, I received it in India, I received it through Mhara buildings and SRA complexes and stuff like that. So I was like, Bauhaus is boring and this and that. That's in my head. Last year, actually, almost on the same day. Today is what's today's date? 20th, 21st. 22nd. No, it was last June. That actually I went to. I was in Stuttgart, so I went to the Bauhaus building and that we saw today. And I must say that it completely kind of stunned me with its exquisiteness. It was beautiful, right? And in its own way, I could have. I stood up before actually going there. I had all kinds of ideas about my reaction would be that it would be a boring building, that it doesn't care about joy, it doesn't care about lots of things, you know. But actually, if you go to the building, it is really an exquisite kind of sculpture in light. The way that it draws light and the way that the details work, it's a really, really beautiful building. So I don't want you to imagine that merely because a building, in this case, claimed to be completely self-involved and self-reflexive and did not have anything to do with the context, it wasn't a great experience. It was a great experience to go to. But my own judgment had been kind of based upon the fact that, based upon the, I guess I'll come to how I received the Bauhaus. So you'll get a sense as to where my approach is. So what happens is that in Germany, with the Bauhaus, there is the rise of the Nazi party. And Hitler is, of course, not interested in things like this ugly new modernism. He is aiming for what can be called the Heimat, Heimat, an idealized imagination of living in Germany that would be, in some senses, in these old rustic sort of ways. कि पुराना जो cottage होता है ना, वैसे लोगों को ले रहना चाहिए. Actually, when I was in Stuttgart, I went to one such colony. Stuttgart has two very interesting places like that. One is a colony where these neo-traditional houses have been built for good Germans by the Hitler regime. And the other place, which was just built a little bit earlier, is an entire colony designed with modernist buildings, with buildings by Gropius, Le Corbusier, by Mies, which actually form a large kind of complex as an example of what it can mean to live in a modern world. So as you can imagine, you have these two very contrasting imaginations of ideal living that happen in the late 1930s or so in Germany. एक बोल रहा है कि हमारा आइडियल जो है ना वो पास्ट में है, रूरल जर्मनी में, जहां हम प्योर शुद्ध लोग होते थे. And then there is this other imagination that says that, damn, all these oldies, we need to kind of build our new future on a rational thought. When Hitler comes to power, what happens is that immediately these new ways of seeing things are seen as corrupt and as something that is, क्या बोलते हैं वो जो ये नए लोग हैं ना, ये कुछ को गंदगी ला रहे हैं, ये जूइश लोग होते हैं, ये करप्टिंग आइडियाज लाते हैं, और हमें हमारा प्योर जर्मन कल्चर लाना चाहिए. हमारी इंडिया में हम प्योर इंडियन कल्चर जो बोलते हैं, वहाँ उनका प्योर जर्मन कल्चर था. ठीक है. और उसके कारण what happened is that they started targeting the Bauhaus. Now, what happens when they start targeting the Bauhaus is that a lot of the Jewish teachers, they say, okay, we're getting out of here because our lives are at stake, man. And that meant that a lot of the great intellectuals of Germany and Berlin all left. And where did they leave to? They obviously left to the place that they would be welcomed, which is a lot of them went to America. And the American schools of architecture were anyway very envious of the fact that this great new movement is happening in Germany that is influencing us. But we don't. We would also like to participate in that. So what happens is that somebody like Walter Gropius goes to Boston and starts teaching at Harvard University and builds his house there. Now in Harvard, he gets up. I mean, he's must have been. I mean, I don't know, but he must have been a very, very charismatic and influential man, because he rises up in the ranks. He becomes extremely kind of popular. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, India is kind of gaining independence. And the same thing is happening here, is that we need to kind of imagine a new nation. We need to imagine ourselves as, we need to imagine an architecture for this new nation. And, we have this idea that we need to kind of modernize ourselves. Corbusier is brought in to design Chandigarh, as that story you already know. And of course has his own legacy and has his own acolytes who follow him, including B.V. Doshi, etc. And that there's one whole story that happens. However, there's another story. An architect called Habib Rahman, okay, and another architect called Achyut Kanvinde, one from Calcutta and one from Bombay. They both go to the United States and study under Walter Gropius, and get extremely influenced by that very idea that we can build a new nation, we can build a new imagination through rational thought. So they come back to India with these incredible kinds of ambitions of being able to participate in nation building through rational thought. And Nehru himself, who really believed in the scientific as a way of thinking about the future nation, kind of involved them directly in the making of the new cities of Delhi and in the making of new architectural institutions. So what you have here is Achyut Kanvinde and Habib Rahman working with organizations like the Public Works Department, working in government, okay, and building an architecture that shapes what we think is the architecture of government buildings in India. If you look at the kinds of work that they do, I think if you run a search on your computers for Habib Rahman, I mean, I have already done it, so maybe we can just take a few, take a few images from there. Like I'll just share it. 1 second. You guys can see this image. Hello.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's there.
Yeah, so this is Habib Rahman, and he's building all kinds of government institutions in Delhi. This is Patel Bhavan. He also builds, let me see, Rabindra Bhavan, Dak Bhavan, all these buildings that this is the World Health Organization's headquarters in Delhi. This is inside Rabindra Bhavan. This is Rabindra Bhavan is an important cultural institution in Delhi. Uh, these are all photographs that his son Ram Rahman has been using to really talk about an idea of Indian modernity. And these are articles that are available online. You can just run a search for Habib Rahman and you'll find a lot of these images that are curated by Ram himself. The next time Ram is in the city, maybe we invite him to give us a lecture on the legacy of his father. The other important architect is of course Achyut Kanvinde, whom we have a great book in the library, recently kind of compiled by his son. But these stories of architecture, because they are so deeply embedded within, I guess you could call it the boring government bureaucracy, never become as heroic or famous as, let's say, the great B.V. Doshi or Charles Correa story, who are never really working within government organizations, but very often are working with them, doing a project here and there for them. But this architecture, the architecture of rationality, the architecture of light and ventilation and H by 3 and H by 5, starts influencing housing projects, starts influencing government buildings around the country. And it also becomes very useful because now the Public Works Department wants to build buildings everywhere in the country. It wants to build a building in Sikkim, and it wants to build a building in Chennai, and it wants to build a building in Kashmir. And what they do is that the same architects, or so not the same architects as much as the same idea of a certain kind of architecture becomes the norm. Modernist aesthetic, chhajja that covers just enough, a certain aesthetic of economy becomes the way in which the language of what is called the great new modern architecture of the country becomes enshrined. So when I join architecture, so this of course, there's a school of architecture like SPA Delhi that becomes very deeply influenced by that. Sir JJ College of Architecture becomes influenced by that. This idea of architecture like a Bauhausian idea, which says that there are basic rules for design, form follows function, we have to be economical, and light and ventilation is the key to all kind of good architecture, becomes the way in which what is called good architecture becomes enshrined within all syllabus. So when I joined architecture in 1989, I am deeply trained and conditioned in this mode. My first years have basic design, which consists of making grids and saying, okay, this is cool color, warm color, this is good composition, that is bad composition, that kind of stuff, which I could never understand because I could never figure out what was the rationality for it. Like, क्या है? मुझे कुछ समझ नहीं रहा था, सब arbitrary लग रहा था मुझे. And then we had entire courses that were not training you about the context. The context did not matter. What mattered was the internal logic of a building itself. The sizes of things, the shapes of things, the organizational systems of things, and the fact that the minimum required only was given. If you give more, you're wasting money. So there was this entire aesthetic of, let's say, poverty or frugalism, I'd say, not say poverty. That was also enshrined as one of the value systems that we had because we were still thinking that we are a developing country. Therefore, as a developing country, we can't waste money on these horrible things called buildings. And that is how my entire training happened. So my entire engagement with the Bauhaus was through that. So naturally, then when I was going to the Bauhaus building in Germany, it was conditioned to try and see that, like, ki yaar, I was taught such to imagine that, such boring architecture is good architecture. Let's see what where this all comes from. And I was completely taken by surprise by the fact that the building is actually extremely beautiful. It has a great presence. It makes extraordinary spaces, and it's very generous with with the way that it imagines spaces of learning. Uh, so anyway, that is the entire story of at least the Bauhaus as far as we are concerned. I would really suggest that you kind of read a little bit more about Habib Rahman and Achyut Kanvinde. Also, look at the history of architectural education in India. I think it's an important thing to always consider where we are coming from. What are the biases that are embedded within our architectural curriculum? What are the biases that are embedded in what can be called good architecture? Our history or who we are today, our own biases, can very clearly be traced to some of those important moments from the 1910s and the 1920s that were happening around the world. It has really shaped what we call the morality of architecture, of course with many aesthetic decisions as well. Shirish, Jin, you guys want to add something?
Yeah, Rohan, I just feel that one of the most sort of important things that happens in this period of between the wars is that there is a sense of what do you say, egalitarian sort of ways in which you start to see material. Okay, meaning the war has completely obliterated the differences in the wars continually do that. They obliterate the difference between the rich and poor to a large extent, creating a situation where access to material is limited to everyone. And I find that it is in this that new material production takes a very different turn, which is where the Bauhaus also comes from. That we need to be able to create things for everyone, and everyone is now entitled for a similar kind of way of existing life. So I feel that plays a very important role in this idea of form follows function to create material for everyone. So that's one. The other I find is actually a little bit also to do with the fact that Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies, at some point of time, they are all working together in the same firm. They are all interacting with each other very closely, and there's a lot of discussion on what the future should be like, and where is the new future, how it should not repeat the same mistakes that have been happening. So I think that's one of the kind of driving forces for these guys to start imagining the new. It's a different question that that it turns out to be this kind of way of segregating space, actually, that we suddenly start to divide space for human consumption in a certain way, where you put the human being at the top, and everything else follows below. Okay, so suddenly that kind of shift happens, where man is put at the center of everything much more seriously than the other things that were making the man. So that's just the 3 points. Yeah.
So even when I had gone to, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, when you go to the Bauhaus in Dessau, you have all these houses that have been built there, nearby, all for the various teachers in
The masters' houses, na? They're called masters' houses.
Yeah, the masters' houses, and they're all like tiny little machines, because you go inside and this table will turn, this will open from this side and from that side, as if the building is becoming a machine that mirrors the idea that the man is also a machine. So there's a reduction of the idea of the human being to that of merely of a number to some extent, a number, a calculation, and that calculation then becomes the rational basis upon which you can in many ways imagine a universal man and universal good, like you're saying, that can be achieved with the Bauhaus.
And also the fact that post-war kind of scenario brings in a lot of sort of building activity to the European countries. It happens post the Second War also, and happens post the First War also. That suddenly there are large tracts of land that need to be rebuilt again, and that require you to rebuild very fast. Okay, so your entire sort of mode of production needs to now change, and a lot of use of steel, use of precast, use of all these kind of ideas are emerging from that kind of demand.
True.
Yeah.
True.
I'm also
But
reminded of that film. I think it was a films division film, which had a very similar idea, where they show this man, like this idea of the person also is, with a suit, and then he, like, how the house starts. You open the window, and it's also then acts like a table,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then actually very small type.
But Jin, your
Jin, your
voice is
voice
completely disappearing. You'll have to say everything that you did just again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
better now.
Yeah. Okay. No. So I was saying that this conversation also reminded me of a
Jin, gone. Voice gone.
God, I don't know
Voice.
what's happening. I really don't know what's happening. Is it
Yeah.
better? Is it better?
Every
Yeah.
time you say it's better, but then you start with films division itself.
Okay, so there it was about this mass housing, and how even because it is like it has to be these really small tight spaces, how things within the house can be multifunctional. So a window which will open up to become a table, and but again the way the person is constructed, the man, he's wearing a suit, and he's like, this is the image of this modern man, and living in a house which is of concrete. And like and I think that, like we were discussing earlier, Rohan and Shirish, about this break from the past, and I think it particularly comes from this image making, and as well as material, the form of buildings. And like,
Yeah.
you want to kind of rid yourself of all this, like your history in some ways is seen as this baggage, and you want to kind of really break out from it, and kind of become this new person. Like, you can rid yourself out of all of this if you live in these kind of precise, well constructed homes, for that matter.
I have one suggestion for everyone who's making a PPT. Please also mention very clearly the year in which the building was built. Okay, because I think if we are able to, over a period of this entire semester and the year, if we are able to sort of start placing the buildings and the year in which they were built, a lot of things will start falling in place. So, for example, I'm curious, when did Gropius build the house? You've just generally said it was built between this period and this period, but let's give a year when it was built very specifically. I also, yeah.
Bol.
No, also to just to give another reference, the students should see the Fagus factory building built in 1910 by Walter Gropius, which is much before the Bauhaus. But actually, he is starting to experiment with these ideas much before the manifesto is written and the schools are made. Okay, so and he has patrons who are actually allowing him to do that. Because it's not only the architect who's thinking alike, it's also people at large who are starting to question ideas of the past and what should the future be. Yeah? So we should remember that.
I would also suggest that there is a book that I think everyone should read. It's just a great history and theory book that covers this entire period, which is Kenneth Frampton's Modern Architecture, A Critical History. If you are able to find it online, it'll be it may be there as a Kindle or something like that. But I think it's a good thing to kind of have that book to read. The other thing I'd like to say about people making presentations is that often we take what is given to us very easily because we like, for example, a room was considered too hot and it has very good light. Now, all of these seem to be judgments that are passed on the basis of like somebody has passed a judgment on the basis of something. Yeah, maybe they've experienced it or maybe they've gotten it from somewhere. But it's important for us to always qualify everything that we are saying as something that and where it comes from. Okay. If it's something that you've experienced yourself, you can please say that you've experienced it yourself. If it's something that you feel yourself, you can say is that something that you feel. But if you're getting a report from somebody else, then please mention where it is from, because it just helps clarify what is hearsay information and what is fact. Just another sort of quick reminder. Does anyone have any questions, by the way, or comments? Because the chat box doesn't seem like it's really even kind of operational right now. So if you guys want to ask something, then you can. I guess you'll just have to speak. I guess. I mean, unfortunately, but well, that's the way it is. How do you all? I mean, anyone? No one wants to say anything right now. Should we move on then? Okay, Atira, you want to say something?
Hello.
Somebody say something, because we are not going unless we have at least 2 questions. So I can sit here forever. Did you all did you all know about Habib? Did you know about Habib Rahman's work at all? Atira, did you know about Habib Rahman's work?
No, I hadn't.
Did anyone from the class know about Habib Rahman or Kanvinde? No, I'm only curious because I'm just wondering about the way that we kind of understand our own history. That's all. Did anyone know about Achyut Kanvinde?
Kanvinde actually designed my mother's office, National Insurance Academy.
Oh yeah, right. So that's how you knew about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But see, it's another state institution designed by man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that. Yeah. So much of our architecture has been, our entire government architecture is based on the Bauhaus, and it's strange somehow that in when we've always written our history, this particular angle of our history writing, because it was not as, I guess, glamorous as the Korea Doshi story. It consists of boring bureaucracies and minimum types. It doesn't seem to kind of get the sort of respect, I guess you could call it, or just the sort of attention it deserves. It belongs to, in some sense, a story of Indian architecture that is not glamorous. So,
that book by Peter Scrivers and this guy Rahul. What's his name?
Srivastava something. No, something like that. Amit Srivastava.
Yeah, that book is a good introduction to many of these stories. Yeah, because it does not focus only on the great story of Indian architecture in Charles and Doshi's.
It's not so architect obsessed. The thing what is nice about what is interesting about the Bauhaus also is that, but it's also one of the problems. So what happened with the Bauhaus is that they claimed कि यार हम लोग working class के लिए बनाएंगे, हम mass production use करेंगे, etc. तो मैं बहुत hope के साथ Bauhaus Museum गया था बर्लिन में. बोला कि यार कुछ cheap मिलेगा लेकिन beautiful मिलेगा. Bloody hell, every single object was so bloody expensive. I couldn't kind of buy a postcard, man. I bought postcards, but nothing else. It was like, yaar, ye pura working class dream to chala gaya. Now they've become highly elite, very, very sought after little objects. That's what they've become, actually.
Yeah.
So the entire myth of the Bauhaus being egalitarian is like actually quite false, actually, as of right now. But actually, that I think is being unfair on my part. Because if I think about it, actually, they did manage to create a system that was able to provide housing for so many different people around the world. So, just because they created what they influenced has been far more kind of closer to what they were intending than what they actually did, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. At least those ideas were brought into our sort of public imaginations, Otherwise, so they have a big role to play, and in education they play a big role.
Big role.
Our entire curriculum actually was built on Bauhausian principles of, and it still continues. And it still
Yeah,
continues.
very much. So there's a comment. On the phone, it seems the comments are there, but I can't see the comments on yeah. I don't know what this today. Teams is in a bad state. Yeah, really bad. Anyway, so Nishanti is asking, what really is interesting is how the same cycle is repeated right now. With the rise of the online neo-Nazis that are holding on to these classical styles as pure and ideal examples of Western architecture and ugly communist, brutalist and Bauhaus buildings, not really realizing how this played about a century ago. You're absolutely right. I think that's one of the great things about learning about history, and that's why I think history is one of those. I think I was taught history so badly that I always had a distaste for it. But I think it's something that I've learned to really appreciate nowadays. I'm reading currently, for example, a history of Christianity. I think what really is amazing is that story, that things that have happened in the past continue to haunt us today and actually take on very similar patterns. So you look at it and you're wondering, like, why didn't we learn, man, that we screwed up the first time? Why didn't we learn at that time? Why can't we move beyond this? But it seems as if human societies are perpetually caught up in the same, in the kind of trap of repeating the same cycle over and over again. But there's a philosopher who actually knew that before even we did, and his name was Hegel. And Hegel was really interested in the way that history is written, or history or human societies move in time. And he constantly kind of said that there is always an oscillation or a dialectic, they called it. Right? A dialectic between kind of forces of change, forces forward, forces backwards, forces, and then that struggle is actually the story of history. The story of history is the struggle between opposing forces that are never coming to an equilibrium. They're always trying to, in many ways, pull in other directions constantly. So if you think about, if you even think about today and think about the country as it is today, and the fact that so much art that is considered to be progressive art by one kind of by some kind of people is considered to be anti-national art by another kind of people. I'm just talking about Kunal Kamra, let's say. It's a similar sort of thing. So if there's something that is challenging history, challenging a point of view, in this case, maybe challenging conventional ideas of imaginations of Indian identity, the immediate extreme is to kind of say that it is exactly the opposite of it, or it is anti-national. So it seems as if there's a constant tug between these opposing forces that never seem to be resolving. So he had this idea that there was a thesis and an antithesis as a synthesis, which then lead to another. So a perpetual movement in time that kind of is the writing of history, which is interesting. Niyati has also sent a sort of link, which is, I don't know what the link is. What's the link? Nishanti, is it? Who's it? I can't see.
It's an article that I thought really related to what I was saying about how architecture sort of perceived like as if it's like an opposition neoclassical architecture versus mass production modernist architecture. I thought it was interesting and related.
Yeah. You're right. You're talking about the Trump's latest thing, na? Yeah, I know this. Yeah, it is the same story. Modernism,
or something like
modern,
that.
yeah, modernism and progressive forces always are framed as those that challenge history, and many times it can also, they automatically then challenge entrenched positions of power, and then entrenched positions of power like to kind of imagine that their own identity is based on historical forms that legitimizes their own sense of who they are. तो ऐसे ऊपर नीचे तो होता है, and that is actually what ended up being the demise of the Bauhaus. The strange thing is that the Bauhaus didn't do very well in America. One would imagine that actually it, I think there were a few projects in the cities that were built on these modernist planning principles, and maybe some high rises that not really based on Bauhaus principles, but rather they are based on, I guess, new technologies and capitalism. Yeah. And the most suburban housing was not based on any Bauhausian kind of idea. It was based on ideas कि हमें घर चाहिए, porch चाहिए, backyard चाहिए, in some sense a new traditionalist idea of home. But yet they seem to find a home in the academics of America, which is an interesting story also. I mean, contradiction.
Rohan, they find a home in the academics of America as a very critical way of looking at the American society and the way space organization operates. Because I think Ford models play a very big role in American production. The factory production in America took on a turn which was like at a massive scale compared to even the regeneration of European post-war kind of efforts. Like large scale productions allowed for everyone to have cars and products at disposal, right? And who cared about what Europe was doing? They had these guys were riding cars cross country by 1930s, So
I think what happens is that somehow Europe continues to remain an intellectual kind of force, but stops being in any other sense an import, like intellectual and cultural, because a lot of Americans came from Europe. So they had this idea that वहाँ हमारा culture है, यहाँ हम पैसा बनाने आए हैं, यहाँ हम future बांधेंगे. There's that sort of idea of Europe. Europe is old Europe. So it's a place for the church, it's a place for philosophy, it's a place of like beautiful Italian villas and all can exist there. That's where we'll get our architectural influences from. So you can do neoclassical that looks like something in Rome or in we make our new history on the American land by referring to an imagined history of Europe.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, interesting thing. Anyway, I think we should move on. Are there any more comments, by the way?
How did Bauhaus come to an end?
So what happens is that Bauhaus officially comes to an end with the movement away from Germany. Effectively, the school shuts down. But the influence of the Bauhaus continues even today. You have many schools of architecture, many ideas that we continue to hold on to as vital, like light and ventilation, etc., that can be traced to some extent in the way that we accessed or the Bauhaus arrived to us. So I don't think the Bauhaus, effectively the school ended. It shut down, and the Nazis took over the whole of took over, and they just kind of got rid of it. But I think the traces of the movement, just in terms of its effect on culture, continue until today, through many different ways, in art, architecture, in many different ways you'll find it. Or kuch? Okay, I need to go for my other meeting. Shirish, Janella, you guys can wrap this up, and bye guys. I guess we'll do Mies and suprematism. Mies and suprematism. Suprematism karte hain. Huh?
Okay, so two students will present.
Yeah.
All right. Can we have two students? Can we have two students who present Mies's work?